Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay? My name is Joel French. I'm the Executive Director at Public Interest Alberta, and in that role I get the privilege of sitting on Parkland Institute's advisory board. And so that's the capacity I'm here with you today. And did you guys have a good time last night? Yeah? Me too. I do have to profusely apologize, or I was told to profusely apologize for the coffee situation. They are working on the coffee situation, and these things happen. They've happened before, and they'll happen again. Is it there? Is it ready? Okay, well, we're going to start, so you can get it at the break. I'll sit down in solidarity with you, because there's no bigger coffee drinker than me. So we talked last night, of course, about neoliberalism, and we're going to talk about that a lot more today, I think. I know Linda McQuaig last night talked about tax cuts, cuts to public services, deregulation, privatization. And as she was talking about that, it hit me that conservatives are just liberals in a hurry. So I'm going to get right into introducing Martin. Martin and I met a couple of years ago at another conference, and it was a little while ago, maybe 6 or 8 months ago, when I was doing my sort of daily news scan, and I saw this article that Martin had written in The Guardian. The title was something like, "We need a response to Trump, and progressive populism is the answer." And after I read that article, it was a couple of days later, I was in a committee meeting to give advice to plan this conference, and I said, "Look at this article. I really think we should get Martin out here." And he sits here today, so I'm really excited about that, and that I get the privilege to introduce him. So Martin Lukacs is, did I say that right? Martin Lukacs? Maybe shorten the second syllable. We were talking about this last night. So Martin Lukacs is a journalist who writes for The Guardian newspaper. He was an organizer and co-author of the LEAP manifesto. You may have questions for him about that. And has been involved in movements for social and ecological justice for 15 years, and he lives in Montreal. He's got a very short bio, but without further ado, I'd like you to welcome Martin Lukacs.
Thanks so much, Joel. And good morning, everyone. How y'all doing? So I'm grateful to Parkland for inviting me, to Gail, I don't know if she's in the room, and all the volunteers for their fabulous organizing, to the workers here at the University of Alberta, without whom events like this wouldn't happen, and to the Indigenous nations of Treaty 6, on whose territory I'm a guest today. Thanks so much to Linda for that. I don't know if she's here. For that, she's gone, she flew off. I mean, it was a terrific talk. And it was a great reminder that we don't just want to wrench wealth and power from the elite. We also want to have a few laughs at their expense. So I also noted with pleasure that no less than the first 2 speakers of this conference, Linda and I, are both pipeline-hating journalists from the eastern enclaves of Ontario and Quebec. Considering Alberta's climate and the fact that your premier right now is traveling the country selling the Kinder Morgan pipeline, I think it's a real act of bravery on the part of Parkland, or just a temporary lapse in insanity. But no, I mean, seriously, I know that one of my messages today is something that Parkland puts into practice every single day, and that's recognizing that people are much more ready for a much bolder politics than we're regularly led to believe by the very serious pundits of Canada, who shrink-wrap their out-of-touch ideology in the language of pragmatism. Indeed, the last time I was here in Edmonton was in 2016 for the LEAP manifesto at the NDP convention, and going by the media reports, I was it made it seem like I and others had to make a very hasty retreat to the airport after. But in fact, the positions of the LEAP, like the zany notion that we should be listening to scientists and indigenous peoples who are telling us not to upend the natural cycles that allow life to exist on this planet. That is overwhelmingly supported by the NDP's membership and indeed many, many people across this country. I guess this morning, maybe I could also be accused of adopting a kind of risk-averse, pragmatic approach. I'm not going to try to be another Easterner lecturing you about your province. I'm instead going to be partaking in a hallowed Western Canadian tradition, namely politically bashing a member of the Trudeau family. But we can definitely return to Alberta-specific themes in the Q&A and try to stir up some more controversy if you want. So I guess in light of there not being coffee this morning and it being very early on a Saturday, I'm not usually this mentally active this early. I was thinking we could take a few minutes to kind of get everyone's blood flowing. So with your indulgence, maybe everyone could stand up. And turn to someone in the audience who you ideally haven't met before. And you're going to introduce yourselves and then answer two questions. So the first is, can you remember what you felt the morning after the 2015 federal election in Canada? And the second question is, what did you expect of the Justin Trudeau government? So the first is, what did you feel that morning? And the second is more analytic, what did you expect? And we'll take 2 minutes each to answer that question. Do people want to just throw out in a word or a sentence max some of what they shared? Really just a sentence max.
Glad Harper's gone.
Glad Harper's gone. What's that?
We've done it again.
We've done it again. Back and forth. Broken promises. Indigenous rights supported, not supported. Warm, cold. Lip service. Okay.
Prefer Rachel to Kenny.
Prefer Rachel to Kenny.
Handsome hegemony.
Handsome hegemony. That's a nice turn of phrase. What's that? Yes, definitely.
If we have a gay physician running against Kenny in Calgary Lougheed by-election.
Is that what you thought the morning of 2015? Okay. Right, so
It's just as bad as Ira Fist.
what was that? Velvet glove, is it?
Fuzzy mitten is just as bad as Ira Fist.
Nice. Outflanked by liberals again. That is a habit.
Is gender parity just window dressing?
Very good question.
The total madness on the day of the election, I still am not over it. If I see that Trudeau, I will say, you can only take my fuzzy picture if you bring in proportional representation.
That was all impressively compressed into one sentence with some subclauses. So like me at Trudeau's election, I'm sure many of you got similar messages from international friends. Thank God Harper is gone. You guys are the good guys again. And of course, the inevitable, you now officially have the hottest prime minister ever. But the crowning feature of Trudeau's government, as many of you know, hasn't been real change. It has been, I want to argue, political mystification. Trudeau, I think, is a smooth-talking centrist who has put the most coiffed gloss yet on the bankrupt and besieged neoliberalism of the age. And his true achievement, I think, is to forge a uniquely 21st century politics of hype. If we on the left don't channel the existing and growing anger that will inevitably arise as Canadians discover what's behind the shiny packaging, I think it's going to be the right wing that capitalizes. Of course, none of this is what you see in the press headlines, especially in the international press. You know them, the ones that read like a parody of the most schmaltzy, tacky internet stories. Let me give you a sampling, just to remind you. Justin Trudeau's 7 secrets to being extraordinarily charming. Good guess, close. Meet the Prime Minister of Canada, our new man crush. Yeah, these are all real. This one's from the Huffington Post. Trudeau does jazz hands at the G20. How could we forget the Rolling Stone headline? Is he the free world's best hope? And the last one, which I'm embarrassed to admit, is from The Guardian, the newspaper I write for. Can Justin Trudeau's socks bring peace to the world? I mean, Trudeau may be, particularly well suited to this kind of coverage, but none of it is accidental. It's been carefully and consciously sought out by his strategists. They have styled Justin into the world's first clickbait prime minister, a living and breathing TED Talk, offering a stream of undeniably enjoyable post-political content that airbrushes out any conflict over interests and ideologies. And I think in part this played so well because it was such a contrast to Stephen Harper. It is such a contrast to Stephen Harper, who kind of had the personality gift of coming off as both viciously hateful and unflappably emotionless. And I think many of us did feel a kind of psychic relief that morning after the 2015 election, after a decade of Harper. And it made us especially predisposed to approve of this kind of, obviously pleasant regard of his. But perhaps the defining feature of Justin Trudeau's speeches, his public commentary, is that it shies away from polarization and embraces versatility. So it's blandly positive, strenuously empty, and it's always vague enough to be open to almost any interpretation. Postmodern. I sometimes call him like the Ryan Gosling of neoliberal politics. I mean, he's just this like unblinking, not very good actor, blank slate onto whom you can just project any and all of your desires and wants. So there's this quote, many of you probably have heard it, from Justin. We are who we are, and Canada is what it is because in our hearts, we always know that better is always possible. I mean, it's like the best animal viral videos. If you object to it, it could only be because you're like a boorish hater. He's also kind of used this style of rhetoric in describing the Liberal government's essential economic philosophy. So in a speech to the Liberal Convention in 2014, he laid it out. Too much government is an enemy of freedom and opportunity, but so too is too little. Governments can't do everything, nor should they try, but the things it does, it must do well. As Larry Summers reminded us on Thursday, fiscal discipline is important, but sustained growth is the only route to balance budgets over the long term. To create that growth, we have to get the big things right. So this is like vintage Trudeau at the pinnacle of his rhetorical form. He comes across as moderate but ambitious, a sound, responsible manager, but also an outside-the-box thinker. You can read into his words whatever you'd like. There's a commitment to more government funding or for shrinking the welfare state, a belief in Keynesian interventionism or staid neoliberal discipline. This sort of liberal speak reminds me of a quote from Groucho Marx, the comedian. He once said that these are my principles. If you don't like them, well, I have others. So, I mean, this style of rhetoric serves a very specific purpose. Like, as with the most glossy kind of corporate speak, which Trudeau actually honed on the kind of speaker's circuit before he ran for politics. It disguises more than it reveals. But what's interesting is that on a few occasions and in a few forums, Trudeau has kind of let his cuddly mask slip and revealed that, in fact, he's quite lucid about the political role he's playing. In 2015, just before the election, he delivered this warning. And I might say, if we don't deliver fairness, Canadians will eventually entertain more radical options. All of the time I've spent with Canadians tells me that the status quo is not sustainable. Change is coming, my friends. What we need is leadership and a plan to shape that change responsibly for the benefit of all. A status quo with slight modifications is not really the most compelling campaign platform. And responsible change doesn't have quite the same ring as real change. About a year after he had won the election, he gave an interview to The Guardian, actually. And this was probably the most candid that I've ever found him be in public. He said, "We were able to sign a free trade agreement with Europe at a time when people tend to be closing off. We're actually able to approve pipelines at a time when everyone wants protection of the environment. We're being able to show that we get people's fears and there are constructive ways of allaying them, and not just ways to lash out and give a big kick to the system." Who knew that a woke progressive hero could utter something so candidly cynical? Trudeau is saying, thanks to kind of skillful liberal statecraft, that even in the face of massive opposition to free trade agreements that undermine local economies, undermine workers' rights, undermine environmental protection, they were still able to succeed in inking the deal. And that despite enormous hunger in Canada for building out a renewable energy economy in place of planet-torching pipelines, they still managed to greenlight them without facing steep political costs. And also that, aware of the anger and despair that exists in this country, they found ways to absorb, mitigate, and contain it, rather than, God forbid, channeling it into opposition against the billionaire class and mobilizing it for transformative change. Rarely has Trudeau been so sparingly clear that his goal is not to dismantle our present system, but to assiduously defend it. So it's really no wonder that he's become the darling of Davos, idolized by a global liberal establishment who are kind of searching for a savior to salvage a destructive and disastrous political order that they've been presiding over for 3-4 decades, that today is under siege from both the right and the left. I would say that Trudeau is best understood as part of the current of neoliberalism associated most often with the Clinton and Obama wing of the Democratic Party, and often described as progressive neoliberalism. It may sound like an oxymoron, but it's not. Progressive neoliberalism, which really kind of emerged in the early 90s, or was cemented in the early 90s under Blair in England, under Clinton, the first in the States, and arguably Chrétien here in the 90s, was supposed to be about kind of creating a third way between communism and capitalism. But in fact, it's really just an accommodation to the neoliberal order. And we've seen many social democratic parties as well go through this process of accommodation. It's often marked by a kind of incantations about diversity, empowerment, tolerance, an embrace of multiculturalism and women's rights, alongside a politics of triangulation, so picking and choosing from policies of both the right and left, a neglect of the social safety net, an abandonment of manufacturing, support for this free trade agreement, which free trade agenda globally that has entrenched these free market policies, and ultimately a total and an unerring faith in the power of the market. So, we see Justin Trudeau marching in gay pride, being celebrated for introducing, gender parity into his cabinet. He's got countless initiatives with Ivanka Trump and others to bring more women into the upper ranks of the corporate world, all alongside a neoliberal agenda that has devastated manufacturing in this country, devastated the lives of all workers. U.S. feminist political theorist Nancy Fraser writes, ideals like diversity and empowerment, which could in principle serve different ends, now gloss policies that have devastated manufacturing and what were once middle-class lives. And so Trudeau kind of infusing these very shallow conceptions of social emancipation to inequality exploding financial capitalism has really become the latest and maybe most deft practitioner of progressive neoliberalism. And we know that taken as a whole under Obama, these are the kind of policies that created such fertile ground for the new right-wing populism that has so viciously triumphed in the United States, and could arguably emerge here in Canada as well. And rather than look in the mirror, we've seen the liberal establishment in the US kind of engage in really absurd contortions to do anything but look in the mirror. So they've sought out foils to explain their electoral defeat, the basket of deplorables. They blame Bernie. Now, of course, they're fixated on the Russian intervention. And they've also looked northward to Canada for looking at Justin Trudeau as a kind of great centrist savior. Just listen to the hushed tones in this publication from the Global Progress Initiative, which is the network of Obama and Clinton-esque think tanks who actually lent their machinery to Trudeau for the 2000. They gave him the database, they gave him consultants, they gave him some of the policies that he used from their kind of global manual. So they write, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has led a new movement of inclusive and inspirational politics to end more than a decade of conservative power. We are convinced that Trudeau will become the paragon of the progressive movement. I actually, myself, I prefer Perry Anderson's description for this kind of politician. He calls types like him yuppie simulacra of populist breakthroughs. The thing is that even these kind of yuppie simulacra have not stemmed the tide of anger and not really kind of satisfied the hunger for change in Canada. Let me quote to you some really shocking statistics and analysis about Canada that I was reading in a publication yesterday. They're taken in March of 2017, so a year and a half after Trudeau's election. Over 40%, and this gives you a sense of the state of neoliberalism in Canada. So over 40% of people in Canada who identify as working class say they were middle class 10 years ago. 2/3 of people who are poor today say they weren't poor 10 years ago. 80% of Canadians think the elite are out of touch with ordinary people. The public are increasingly rejecting neoliberalism. Trickle-down economics has been laid bare as a cruel hoax. And ask the following question: if the current patterns of stagnation among all except those at the very top continue, I would not be surprised to see the emergence of violent class conflicts. 57% of people in Canada agree with this. And the last quote from this report: the public have given the government a strong mandate to pursue a bolder, more ambitious, more progressive federal government. Can anyone guess where I read these incendiary lines? It's not from a publication. It's not from the latest issue of The Socialist Worker. It's from the analysts at the staid and utterly mainstream ECOS polling agency. I think something has gone really awry in our political life when a polling agency is outflanking to the left all of our political parties, including the NDP. I mean, what was really cute about the report actually is that they spelled neoliberalism NEO-L, as if they had just discovered this analysis about neoliberalism and were confused that it actually referred to the Liberal Party of Canada. And even with this kind of political tinderbox that's ready to be harnessed for a much bolder politics, I sometimes worry that our social democratic comrades in this country have kind of taken to the notion that that dazzling kind of feel-good, everyone wins politics are still the best strategy. And I think that instead we should be looking for a model to England, where Jeremy Corbyn has really helped remake the Labour Party from one of these third-way, very neoliberal parties, and who just recently pulled off one of the biggest kind of electoral upsets in modern British history, right? The party was supposed to undergo this complete demise, and yet now they're within striking distance of forming government. And it's fair to say that Jeremy Corbyn is kind of the antithesis of Justin Trudeau. He loves making jam. He's refused until very recently to wear a tie. And on holidays, instead of relaxing with the Aga Khan at their opulent beach home, he goes for bike trips around Europe. He's definitely not getting put on the covers of GQ or Vanity Fair. By the only ones he's making are the internal kind of emergency playbooks of the UK military and MI16, the ones whose covers read, "Activate in case of socialist revival." And his Labour Party, so they put out a manifesto just during the election. Well, I mean, in fact, it was leaked by members of his own party, part of the kind of Blairite wing who have been trying to sabotage him at every turn. And what was fascinating is that when it got leaked the next day, the newspaper headlines were screaming, "Jeremy Corbyn wants to turn the clock back to the 1970s." And what was remarkable is that people, especially young people, actually read the manifesto and were like, cheap education, pensions, livable wages, the 1970s sound pretty good. And it turns out, rather than everyone claimed his constituency were just radical utopians or Trotskyists, and in fact, there were actually millions of people ready to embrace policies that take on the vested interests and spend massively on education, clean energy, healthcare. I mean, he has a plan to invest $250 billion in the economy. One of his proposals, which was also constantly scolded by the mainstream media, was taking back into public hands Britain's railways, water, and energy system. Which since privatization in that country have been run more expensively, inefficiently, and it is the right thing to do. It is an overwhelmingly popular, and it should be on the table here in Canada as well. So, while Trudeau's not, while Corbyn isn't like a selfie god like Trudeau, he has become the subject of kind of viral joke memes in the same way. One of my favorites is basically photos of him pointing at things that should be nationalized. So one meme has a liberal saying through sobs, "You can't just say everything is nationalized, please." Meanwhile, Corbyn points at a seagull flying past, "Nationalized." "You, sir, at the back there in the red sweater." "Yes, you." "Nationalized." That's a meme as well, basically, I'm quoting. I recommend people visit, there's a website called, it's memegenerator.com/Jeremy Corbyn, nationalize that shit, exclamation point. So, these are the kind of memes I personally want to see in Canada. And I only know of a single poll in the last 10 years that's been done assessing Canadians' feelings about nationalization, including the energy sector, but without a single public figure actually advocating for this stuff, like a mainstream political figure, never mind a political party. 50% of Canadians support the idea of nationalizing the oil industry, including 40% of people in Alberta. And I mean, someone asked a question yesterday about worker ownership and democratizing the economy. And what's interesting is that you know, in England, the Labour Party is not, you know, they've certainly rejected the model of nationalization that happened decades ago, right? That's highly centralized, state bureaucratic oriented, and one of the more underplayed, certainly, parts of the platform is a call for a massive decentralized democratization of the economy in England, with worker co-ops being encouraged by the government. Yeah, and I think, I mean, another example too of what is possible and should be a model for Canada is what has happened in Germany. I mean, it's a very uneven development, but they have over the last 15 years undergone the beginnings of an incredible transition off fossil fuels and off the old kind of mega energy projects. So they over the last 15 years have created 400,000 jobs in the clean energy sector, created 1,000 energy cooperatives that keep profits in local communities, and 30% of their energy today is from renewables. And it's a very similar country along the similar industrial lines to Canada. So I think if the left doesn't start seizing these opportunities, it will be the right who channels them in a xenophobic, reactionary direction, who will punch down rather than punching up, as we ought to be. So recently, actually, there was a Canadian political organization that started using Jeremy Corbyn's catchy slogan from the last election, "For the many, not the few." Does anyone know which organization it was?
NDP Socialist?
NDP Socialist? Conservative.
Quebec's only there.
Well, it wasn't an insurgent NDP candidate. It wasn't an insurgent kind of labor leader. It was Ontario Proud, which is a social media front group of the Ontario Conservative Party. Yeah, I mean, they have understood. They're aiming to appropriate that kind of messaging. I mean, it shows the wide appeal of that kind of politics, and also the slickness of the right wing's thinking. And Ontario Proud actually now has nearly 300,000 followers on Facebook, which makes them the most popular political page in Ontario, if not in Canada. Just for comparison, Broadbent has 38,000 followers, Lead Now has 58,000, and the federal NDP 115,000. So I think it shows how much opportunity there is for the left if they're able to, willing to harness this kind of sentiment. So sometimes I feel that it's the task of every generation of leftist in this country to kind of like reinventing the wheel, kind of get wise to the ways of the Liberal Party. I feel like if I had friends in high places in the federal state, my preferred form of the patronage that I would like to receive is a really cushy budget to produce some Canadian Heritage Minutes. People know the Canadian Heritage Minutes, right? The one I would like to make is about the Liberal Party's history of progressive fakery. Passing from King to Pearson to Trudeau Sr. to Chrétien to Trudeau Jr. A legacy of broken promises, of political opportunism, of selective co-optation. I would start with Mackenzie King bemoaning to Winston Churchill that the CCF was the common enemy of Liberals and Conservatives alike, and that he would need to, quote, see to it that I do not lose any members through the CCF. In the 60s, Lester Pearson also kind of read the tea leaves, knew the country was moving left, and said, I don't intend to let the NDP steal the popular ground of the left. Pierre Elliott Trudeau, of course, after losing the election in 1979, he also took a sharp turn left. And then I would round out the the Heritage Minute with an appearance from Jean Chrétien saying, "We are not the party of the big corporation, but the party of the little people in Canada." And yet, it's the Liberal Party, starting with Trudeau through Chrétien to now, I would say, that has actually done the most to effect this neoliberal shift in this country. I think Linda mentioned this yesterday, but it actually wasn't Harper who implemented the deepest and most ruthless cuts in Canadian history. It was the Liberals of the 1990s. So, the Liberals actually, they swept away a Conservative government, waving the Red Book, which was this really ambitious social program. Does that sound at all familiar to what happened 2 years ago? And then once they were in power, they proceeded to light it on fire. They slashed funding to healthcare and housing, unemployment insurance, welfare, women's groups, basically laying the foundation for the downsizing of the Harper era. It was really in those years that we saw probably the most pronounced shift in Canadian society. There was a huge spike in inequality. We became much more dependent on the market. And the state's ability to actually intervene in our lives in a positive way was severely curtailed. So apart from this kind of like this liberal DNA, federal liberal DNA, I would say that the much of what the Trudeau government does has also was tactically kind of honed in the laboratory of the province of Ontario. So all of Trudeau's key strategists and advisors, many of his staffers, come from the Ontario Liberal government, and they really kind of honed their tactics under McGuinty. They often had kind of like the approach was that they would have they would offer these kind of bold vision, these big policy announcements, and then they would start compromising in the actual implementation. So, for instance, McGuinty offered, and this was probably the most bold environmental move at that point. He promised a phase out of coal in 2003. It was supposed to be completed by 2007. It didn't happen until 2014. But it was still something that was far more radical than anything happened under the Ray government. And the Liberal government of Ontario, what they did is that they used these big kind of bold policy announcements to organize civil society, or it might be better to say that they use it to disorganize civil society. So what they did on the environmental front, for instance, was just to take one example, is they asked all the big environmental groups to get together and to develop just one or two kind of priorities. Don't give us 15, give us like 2 or 3. And when we do it, you'll praise it. And you've got to keep saying that this is big, this is the biggest thing we've seen. And when you talk to kind of political staffers, when you talk to people who lobby political staffers under this government, it's the same. It's under the Trudeau government. It's the same thing. There's tons of pressure to kind of toe this line, and what it does is it kind of hamstrings groups because you're on the hook, right? The Liberal government can say to you, "Look, we're doing the thing you asked. It's just taking longer than we thought." And it also helps divide. I mean, they're very good about dividing and conquering movements in this way, right? So the people who are working with them on the inside become the good guys. People on the outside become the bad guys. There was one environmental campaigner who was lobbying a staffer recently told me that this high-level Liberal staffer had asked them at the beginning of a meeting, "Are you a leaper or a helper?" So. In France, actually, they have a phrase for this style of politics, of kind of bold announcements that then are followed by not very much. In French, it's called effet l'annonce. So that roughly translates as the announcement effect. I mean, it sounds much better in French, but basically, it's a significant decision that's delivered in this spectacular fashion that is almost certain to net widespread praise, and then that distracts from the fact that one may never quite get around to actually realizing that policy. And as we know, Justin Trudeau has kind of taken this tactic national and even international. Many of his sweeping proclamations are often made abroad or aimed abroad. as for instance when he kind of subtweets Trump. So he's pledged to tackle austerity or climate change, ensure the rights of warmly welcome refugees, or fulfill the rights of indigenous peoples. And it's a kind of, I call it the Trudeau two-step. I mean, the aim is often to get an enormous amount of fawning international coverage, which then kind of bolsters their credibility domestically. And we've seen this kind of rhetorical turn from Trudeau. He kind of channels the Occupy movement and has talked about taxing the 1%. That was a line that was introduced into his kind of shtick by Gerald Butts. He also took advantage of Thomas Mulcair's really disastrous pledge for no deficit spending in the 2015 election. By contrasting it with the promise of big deficit spending, anti-austerity kind of program, $125 billion in infrastructure spending. And I mean, I think that was a big part of why the NDP lost that election. What's interesting is that what always follows next are not policies to ambitiously fulfill these pledges. They're ploys to kind of quietly evacuate them of any meaning. So, for instance, the 1%, this 1%, the tax against the 1%, that actually turned out to be a massive giveaway to Canada's next richest 10%. And what was interesting is that the reason the 1% didn't really make a fuss when they raised the taxes by 3% about a year ago was because they knew that they could actually just shuffle that money through loopholes. Actually, the very loopholes that the Trudeau government, in perhaps one of their genuinely progressive measures, were trying to then close earlier this summer. And that kind of the $125 billion infrastructure plan, his great anti-austerity pledge, what that has actually turned out to be, in large part, is a stealth privatization program that will have the public shoulder the risk of private companies owning, operating, and profiting from our public sector. Why not, when lending rates are at a historic low, through a public bank, spend billions on infrastructure, right? With real imagination and vision as a way to actually jumpstart a post-carbon economy in this country. So we've kind of seen the Liberal government on issue by issue use this kind of progressive symbolism. So of course, like on climate change, we know that Trudeau's team has kind of presented him as this environmental Adonis. He's always like striking the right poses, whether he's canoeing or kayaking, running along the seashore of Vancouver, or accidentally getting photographed shirtless on some nature hike. And it's the same with his team. Catherine McKenna, for instance, was one of the international figures who really pushed in Paris for the goal of keeping the planet's rise in temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius, right? Which is the demand of low-lying island nations and most of the nations in the global south, who understand what a temperature rise increase beyond that means for their countries. And all of which makes it very easy to forget that Trudeau is actually still using Harper's targets, climate targets, and judged by their deeds, not their words. They're actually blowing past even those. So Trudeau has managed to approve more pipelines than Harper. He's greenlit LNG projects, which Harper was never able to do. He's pushed for Arctic fracking. It's not exactly the scorecard of a global climate savior. Trudeau also talks about a kind of environmentalism of windmills and pipelines, about how oil extraction is going to fund our transition to green energy. It's like saying, like, I'm going to eat a ton of burgers at McDonald's to fuel my exercise regime. Like it doesn't make sense. And I would say that probably where the Liberals have most intensely deployed these kinds of politics of posture is in the pursuit of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. So, everything Trudeau has done, whether it's wrapping himself in ceremonial blankets or doing sunrise rituals at dawn with Indigenous youth in Ottawa, hauling jugs of drinking water door to door in Shoal Lake 41, a community that lacks potable water. Everything he's done has been to kind of underline this commitment. But it hasn't taken very long for Trudeau's platform to fray. So an order, there's been a legal order now, repeated 4 times, that the Liberals should end racial discrimination against the funding for Indigenous children on reserve. And that has been repeatedly ignored. Compensation for 16,000 individuals who were snatched from their homes in the 60s scoop, that's been relentlessly opposed in court. And that historic budget we heard so much about for Indigenous peoples, it actually only starts flowing in 2020, 1 year after the next election. So not exactly the new relationship that Trudeau announced to such rapturous applause. And I think what we've seen under Trudeau actually is an emergence of this kind of reconciliation industry that's geared toward the production of rituals that enact our contrition about past crimes in order to manufacture innocence about the crimes that are happening right now. And like Trudeau he may personally want to do right by Indigenous peoples, but the government is locked into a logic of its own, right? Maintaining exclusive control over Indigenous peoples' lands and resources, continuing policies that are indistinguishable from the Harper years, and indeed indistinguishable really from the last 150 years of colonialism, that are intended to extinguish Indigenous rights and title and politically assimilate Indigenous nations. As the late Art Manuel writes in his posthumously published book, which really is a must-read, it's called Reconciliation Manifesto. He writes, colonialism is not a behavior that can be superficially changed by a prime minister professing sunny ways. It is the foundational system in Canada. And it's this system that, for instance, this year fought an Indigenous girl in court to not have to pay $6,000 for emergency dental care that she needed because her jaw was malfunctioning. Can you guess how much the Liberal government spent to fight her in court? $110,000 for a $6,000 dental fee, which they're legally obliged to pay in any case. Do you know what they did pay $6,000 for recently? A photographer for a single occasion for Environment Minister Catherine McKenna. I mean, that is a testament to this government's priorities. So, kind of hijacking the language of liberation and turning it into a kind of contraption of co-optation or of conquest is kind of part of liberal heritage. And on the Indigenous front, they have used many kind of soothing words: reconciliation, nation to nation, even decolonization. Yet probably nothing has been more slippery than their use of consent. So the Liberals, as we all know, they proclaim their support for the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is really a minimum standard for rights of Indigenous people. And one of the rights that's at the heart of that is the free, prior, and informed consent for development on Indigenous peoples' territories. And the Liberals have been absolutely loath to actually recognize this. I mean, it's obvious why. It sends like shudders through corporate boardrooms. And what they've started doing recently is they are toying with this notion that's... One more minute left? Okay, cool, thanks. How about 5? Thanks. So they've been toying with this notion called collaborative consent. So So what exactly is collaborative consent? Is that like, we say yes, you say no, so we meet you at halfway, split the difference, and go with yes? What's clear about it is that it studiously avoids the actual recognition of the right to say no to developments. And as Indigenous feminists have pointed out by analogy, whether it's territories or bodies, if you don't have the power to say no, then consent is meaningless. So I think we need like a Canadian Orwell to really taxonomize the ways in which the Liberals have managed to mangle and manipulate the English language to serve their ends. So let me close by just suggesting a few ways I think that the left, is already and can respond effectively to the Liberals. One is that we have to remember that Liberals, they always bend to pressure, whichever direction it comes from. So if the left is stronger, it comes from there. In the post-war period that Linda talked about, in an age when political pressure really came from the left, Mackenzie King actually ended up building the welfare state. And in the 90s, in an age when the political pressure came from the right, Jean Chrétien ended up starting to dismantle it. And I think we're in a moment again when the system we live under, capitalism, is on trial. And when so many people, especially the young, are ready to give serious consideration to alternatives. And I think we have to be ready to articulate it, to show it's irresistible, and really to start building it. One of the ways I think that the left needs to be better amongst themselves about that is to learn from the right, the way in which the right wing has been very good at using groups to their right, think tanks, right-wing media, as stalking horses for their ideas, whereas as a way of shifting the center of gravity to the right. Whereas so often the NDP sees anything to the left of them as a threat to be vilified, ignored, or crushed. We have to understand that the center is not some fixed political geography. If we run towards it, it only recedes like a mirage further to the right. We need to drag the center in our direction. And I guess the last thing is that the left used to be really great at understanding that politics ultimately is zero sum, right? That there are always losers and winners, and the gain of one class or one group of people often entails the loss of another. But it's mostly been the right who have really helped people understand that there are losers in politics and that they're the ones who speak for them. And as a result, I think they've been winning for 3 decades. We've lost that sense of conflict, and we need to regain it urgently. Everything about our present political moment tells us that people are ready to revolt against a system that encourages us to settle for so little and to hold out hope for saviors. So by all means, as I sometimes do, admire the Prime Minister in his shirtless glory. But please, let's stop asking for selfies and start demanding a whole lot more. Thank you for listening.
All right, thank you, Martin. We have time for just a few questions and comments before we go to break and let you have coffee. So,
could I suggest, as a aggressive affirmative action policy, that we take 300 years of questions from women, and then maybe we take a few from men?
Yes. We've got 2 women over there who would like to say something.
I would like you to speak about the LEAP manifesto. I was at the NDP convention where we passed the decision to discuss it for 2 years. I do not understand why so many people who say they are progressives are so upset and so in a knot about the LEAP manifesto. I'm beginning to think that we don't understand what a frickin' manifesto is. A manifesto is a short document that gives us suggestions for the way forward. It doesn't lay anything down in concrete. But I want to hear more about what you think happened there and what is happening, because I think the LEAP manifesto in many ways is brilliant, and I can't understand why the left is afraid of it.
Should we take a few more questions and then I can answer them?
Sure. Yeah, so maybe we'll take a couple of more questions because we're short on time, and Martin can take them all on at once. So I know Annika had a comment to make, and then we'll go to the gentleman with the red thing he's holding up in the back.
When you were talking about so well about how Trudeau is and all the liberals are mangling the English language and giving us the idea that they are doing the right thing for us, it sounds like you were giving, I think you were giving the liberals almost the compliment of playing with being true Machiavellian, because that is what Machiavelli told you. If you want to have power, you can tell lies and you can do what you can say all kind of little stories, but you have to just know how to go how far. So that's what the liberals did. So maybe we should become smarter and using a little bit of the good side of Machiavelli and fight back in the same way that the liberals are using, language and propaganda now. Did I make myself clear? No.
Oh, I'm in complete agreement, yeah.
And we'll take one more of the gentleman in the red hat at the back there. And then we'll let you take a go at it.
Okay, I guess you don't gonna like my question, because I want to ask you for some predictions for the future, especially for the dangers for the Canadian economy. I was wondering, what do you think is a major threat? What's going to happen to the Canadian economy in terms of what's going to shift the politics? Is it coming from the right? Is it coming from the left? And what's going to happen? Just some predictions, please.
Thanks for those questions. So for the first one, thank you for asking about the LEAP. It's true, it's kind of strange, like when we put it out, most of the media was like, how dare they call something a manifesto? That's like, there must be disciples of Mao. But in other countries like England, all the political parties, including the Conservatives, put out manifestos. It's kind of standard. And I think at the NDP convention, the membership was, I think, really hungry. I mean, they were seeing what was happening in England with Corbyn. They were seeing what was happening in the States with Bernie. And I think the LEAP kind of crystallized for people a sense of the political opportunity of this moment, right? The fact that something that many of us, I think, thought was really inconceivable, that the political parties like the social democratic parties could actually be, which have been over the last 30 years totally atrophied and hollowed out of rank and file activity, controlled by really a clique of professional consultants. It's the same in all both the Labour Party and the Democratic Party. And I think that's why people, apart from whatever controversy, I mean, the media made it all out to be about the pipelines, right? But I don't think that's why people gravitated in such an excited way to the LEAP manifesto. It was because it really crystallized that direction, and I think it also bucked a kind of trend that we've seen both in NGO organizing and in political parties, which is to really get trapped in single-issue thinking, right? I mean, what the LEAP tried to do is really marry an agenda for economic justice, social justice, racial justice together, right? And if we don't do that, we're going to continue losing in our own isolated struggles. I mean, honestly, I think what happened is that the the NDP establishment really buried the manifesto. I mean, it was supposed. So after that convention, there were supposed to be discussions that happened at the riding level, there was a manual that got put out to facilitate that discussion, and it was supposed to finish by the end of the summer, which was no way really to hold it. But what I think is that there among the NDP membership, there's still a huge hunger for that, and I think that people who are supporters of the LEAP really need to push Jagmeet Singh and other people in the NDP really to carry that forward, because I think if they don't really break with the neoliberal consensus, the NDP is gonna fizzle away.
Well, what really disturbed me is that in the NDP we should at least be able to talk about things. If there are things we can't talk about, we aren't who we think we are, and shame on us if we can't even talk about it.
I totally agree, and I do hope NDP members really take that forward. The Machiavelli one, I mean, yes, I think that Trudeau's government is definitely consulting like a pop Machiavelli guide for dummies for the viral age, and I mean, yeah, we need to learn what they're doing well, but at the same time, like, again, Jeremy Corbyn, he wears frumpy suits, and he has stood by the same policies for 30, 40 years when it comes to inequality and British imperialism, and so I think it's important to sometimes kind of forget the flashy symbolic politics and get back to really the basics. And my predictions, I'll leave that to the economists in the room who much prefer making predictions of that sort. But the biggest threat to Canada's economy, I mean, it's elite wealth and power. And I know that's not one that often gets presented as one, but that is what is just dropping the bottom out of most people's lives, and it's what needs to be confronted in a much clearer way. So.
All right, thank you, Martin, and we've got a gift for you. Thank you so much for coming out here and giving us such an enlightening talk.
Thanks, man.
Yeah.